Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist. Today I have another episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps show that we all know and love. This episode comes from Season 3. It was directed by John Bell and written by Scott Peters. And the episode in question is Click. And no, we're not talking about Adam Sandler's Click. Wink, wink. So, jokes aside, I have a lot to say about this episode because me and this episode go way back to my middle school days when I got back into Goosebumps for the second time during the point when Cartoon Network was first re-airing the Goosebumps show and did for many years following. It brought to my attention a few stories that I didn't know existed and I needed to check out. One was Piano Lessons Can Be Murder and the other one was Click. And I did some research back in the mid-2000s on the internet with what I could. And I learned that Click was a short story in the first Tales to Give You Goosebumps collection. And luckily, my library, I think, had that one and none of the other ones. So I got to experience the short story for the first time after I watched the episode when I was younger. And I loved Click for the longest time. It held up in my memory. If you would have asked me what were some of my favorite episodes when I was maybe like 13, Click would have been probably my top 5 with Piano Lessons Can Be Murdered, the Haunted Mask episodes, and the Werewolf of Fever Swamp. So that tells you how much I love this thing. Unfortunately for Click's episode, it has not held up as much as something like Piano Lessons Can Be Murdered for me, or even other episodes like Werewolf of Fever Swamp or the Haunted Mask episodes. It's nowhere near that. But this episode, I think, reinforces my opinions on the concept itself being worthy for a full Goosebumps book back in the original 62. If you have not watched my discussion video on short stories that should have been full Goosebumps books, I mentioned Click should have been in the 20s of the original series, and it probably should have replaced My Harry's Adventure, or maybe even Monster Blood 3 if we're going to try to erase another book, because I think the concept here would have been fun for the series, and it has a lot of room to expand in a full book setting. And the episode shows all the potential, while the short story version, and I recently reviewed this and talked about it in my Tales to Give You Goosebumps book review, and I also mentioned a portion of it in my ranking of all the short stories from the Tales to Give You Goosebumps series, that I think that the episode just does better with the concept itself. Now, I might be getting ahead of myself with the book versus episode comparison, but stay tuned for that. But I still really enjoy Click as an adult. Rewatching this for review purposes and trying to finish up the Tales to Give You Goosebumps episodes so I can finally put a ranking of all the adaptations from that series in the show. That's been a long time coming. This is still a valiant effort, and what I like to see from the 90s Goosebumps show, taking source material and trying to improve on it or expand on it and do something different with it sometimes and makes it work a bit better. And this is one of those examples that I think outshines that for the most part. So if you have not watched Click's episode, you should really check this out, especially if you're a diehard Goosebumps fan or kids horror fan, because the main actor here started another quite famous, or infamous I should say, Goosebumps episode, and he also starred in a Shadow Zone movie, which was a Goosebumps knockoff. So there you go. With that out of the way, let's start off with the plot overview without giving too much away. So in the episode version here, we still have the same main character from the short story, and his name is Seth Gold. Now, I forget the exact age of Seth in the short story counterpart, but in the episode version, he seems considerably older than your average Goosebumps protagonist, I should say. He feels like he's 13, maybe 14. And I'm saying this because this is true. There are 14-year-old protagonists in the Goosebumps show. Billy Harlan from Welcome to Camp Nightmare and Grady Tucker from The Werewolf of Fever Swamp were both aged up to the age of 14 for some reason. Yes, that is a thing. You can look it up if you don't believe me. So I think Seth Gold is kind of that age anyway. Well, that aside, one day Seth Gold comes home from, I guess, riding around on his bike through his neighborhood, presumably from school, and he finds a package at his doorstep, and he's super excited for it, and he opens it up, and it turns out that it's this humongous 90s looking, futuristic even, universal remote that's supposed to replace his rinky-dink broken one to his living room TV. And because he's so excited to finally have a working remote, and now he doesn't have to get up and turn the channels on the box television that people used to have to do, he wants to sit down and watch television. So he puts on this talk show that he likes, or game show or whatever, and he turns up the volume, notices that the remote works and everything's good. But his sister wants to start tap dancing in the living room, and because she's making a huge fuss, he has to turn up the volume on the TV, which causes her to shout over the TV, and the dog is barking. And for 2 minutes almost in the episode, we get just nonstop noise until Seth kind of hits his breaking point and like jokingly points the remote at his sister and hits the pause button. But when he does it, the dog and his sister actually pause, and he's taken aback by it. He's like, whoa, what's this? What's going on? And he goes over to investigate to see if they're okay. But on the television, there's a random break, and it shows this advertisement from this company called Armchair Electronics. And there's a speaker on there mentioning the type of remote that Seth has, and is warning that this is not a toy, keep it away from children, blah, 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 blah. And Seth is like, okay, that was kind of strange, but whatever. And he gets this bright idea to essentially unfreeze his sister and his dog. And when that happens, he notices that the remote has these capabilities, and he needs to go check out more of them. So he goes up to his room, and he points it at his fish tank, and it turns the hue color of the fish into different colors, and he thinks that's cool. Then he hears some people are outside, so he decides to go outside and venture around outside of his doorstep. And he sees the paperboy riding around on his bike, so he plays around with a few settings like rewind, fast forward. Like I think in the short story it was called freeze frame or whatever. But he plays around with that, and then once the paper is on his lawn, he hits the eject button, shoots up to his hand, and he realizes that he essentially has this godlike power now with this remote, and he wants to see how far he can push it. So he brings it with him to school soon after, and he meets up with his friend Kevin, who is actually an exclusive character to the episode here, I think. Or if he's in the short story, he is like not in there. So he's talking with his friend Kevin, but this bully guy, I think his name is Richard, is out bullying this kid, giving him like a noogie outside of, the school building. And they go over there to try to, put a stop to it and stick up for the kid. But, Seth kind of reveals that he was bullied by this bully himself last year. And since he's gotten older, he feels like he's mildly toughened up. And now that he has this remote, he feels like he's going to be impervious in the situation. So he decides to flaunt the remote in front of his friend Kevin and point it at the bully and starts pushing random buttons, which causes him to essentially change shape and identities because he's pressing change the channel. And it's pretty funny, I should say. There's a couple of different morphs that this guy does. But once he's done doing it and changes it back to his original self, he notices that the bully starts to feel weird and ill because of the treatment of the remote. I should mention this now because I kind of skimmed over the surface of him playing around with this. Seth is being haunted by this jingle. It goes bum, bum, ba, bum, bum. And it goes through a bunch of different electronics throughout the story. And every time he hears that sound, there's a message accompanied with it, whether it's email on his alarm clock or whatever the case may be. There's a warning about misusing the remote, and he keeps getting warned and warned and warned. So keep that in mind. So after this event happens, Kevin knows that Seth has the remote and is pretty much willing to play around with it, let's just say. And they find themselves in a class. And this is very reminiscent to the book. This is a scene, I guess they took it out of the short story, I should say. They're in a classroom, and both of them forgot to study, and there's a pop quiz. So Seth decides to pause the whole class, go up in the front, take the answers, copy them all down, along with his friend Kevin, so they can get good grades on the quiz. But Kevin is taken aback by it and is questioning the ethics and the character of Seth for doing so. And Seth's like, what's the big deal? We're not going to get caught. And you know what? You should just learn to be cool, you know? And Kevin's like, okay, whatever. You're getting on a power trip, buddy. And Seth shrugs it off, cheats on the test, and then turns it in. Well, later that day, he's at home again. He has the remote, and he was watching TV. He knows that he probably shouldn't use the remote on his family at all, but his sister's tap dancing again, causing a commotion while he's trying to watch TV. And then his parents come in to stick up for his sister because he mouthed off to her and to them, and they want an apology. But since Seth isn't having any of it, he decides to push the pause button on all three of them. And before this happened, him and his sister were kind of fighting over the remote, and it caused the remote to fall and crash. So there's a loose bit in it. So when he hits the pause, they're kind of stuck in there. And he's like, you know, I gave you guys a timeout to chill out. Now we're going to take a step back and we're going to take it more calmly. But when he tries to unfreeze them, it won't work. And he realizes that the remote might be broken because it was dropped. So he realizes that he's in pretty much deep dog doo-doo here, and he has to get some help. So he tries to call like the number on whatever, or maybe something phones into him where to go. I think he's with his friend Kevin, and he brings his friend Kevin over to his house to show him what happened with his family. And they're up in his Seth's room, and they get the call saying, show up at this address. This is where a servicer is located in your area. So they venture over there to see what's going on with that. But it's an abandoned building with a broken armchair electronics sign, and it's kind of vacated and nobody's there. So he's like, okay, well, this was a lost cause. So they head back to the house, and they're sitting on the couch playing around with the buttons, still trying to get it to work. And Seth hits his breaking point. He's like, you know what? Screw it. Let's go down to the basement and let's try to fix this thing. So he goes down to the basement, grabs his dad's screwdriver, unscrews the remote, but Kevin's like, you probably shouldn't play around with it. And of course, there's a warning before they do this from the jingle, dun, 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 and they give a message saying you shouldn't try to mess around with the remote. It's very dangerous, but they're ignoring it. And Seth notices that a piece came undone, but when he tries to hover it over where to plug it back in on the circuit board, it like electrically magnetizes itself to the board, which is weird. And he puts the thing back on. Him and Kevin go back up to the living room to unfreeze his parents, and still not working. He smacks it around because this is the 90s and this is what you had to do with remotes. And you still kind of have to do it till this day. It's kind of like the old way of blowing into a cartridge to make it work on a video game system. You just had to be there. But he smacks it in his hand a few times, and it finally turns his parents back on. And once he gets his parents fixed, his parents are like, whoa, look at the time, you know, and they just go back to doing what they were doing before and not really thinking anything of it. And Kevin urges Seth that they need to throw away the remote, and Seth agrees. They go out to the dumpster outside, and they try to put it in the trash can. And while Kevin walks away, Seth's like, what am I doing? And he goes back into the trash can to grab the remote again. Well, this leads to the climax of the story, I should say. It's barely one, but I guess it counts. So Seth brings the remote to school. And once his friend Kevin sees that he has it, Kevin flips out on him saying, dude, what are you doing? And him and Seth get into a quarrel. And Seth points the remote at him and hits the eject button, shoots him into some lockers, and said, don't try that again, or I'm going to come after you with this. Well, after he does that and Seth walks off, there's a phone call on the payphone of the school, and Seth picks up, and they said, all right, well, we've given you so many chances. We're giving you one last one. If you misuse it again, your warranty is going to be voided. And yes, that's what they're going with here. So Seth's like, just leave me alone already. And when he hangs up the phone, Kevin comes up to him and has an altercation. And Seth has had enough, and he points the remote at him again and tries to do something to him, which may or may not backfire, let's just say. And where Seth finds himself is kind of fitting. But we get to, I guess, learn what brought him there but the twist of it all mildly doesn't make sense given everything else. But that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of the Click episode here, without giving too much away, of course. So let's get into the positives of the episode, because I do have a lot here. First and foremost, Seth Gold, if I haven't brought up his name yet, he's played by Dan Wary-Smith. And Dan Wary-Smith, he played Skipper, I think Skipper Matthews in Attack of the Mutant. And he also played a character in a Shadow Zone movie called My Teacher Ate My Homework. I think that's what it's called. And yeah, he's just great in a lot of things that I've seen him in. He's also in this movie that I've watched called The Legend of Gatorface, and it has John White, who starred in Cuckoo Clock of Doom and The Haunted Mask 2, for example. So yeah, he's a Goosebumps alum member that I love seeing in episodes, and he's clearly older than he was at playing Skipper Matthews in this. He's definitely, like, his voice has deepened at this point. I don't know how old he was when he made this episode, but he brought this flair to it that I really enjoyed. He usually plays like the morally ambiguous character very well, and I think this version of Seth Gold is mildly better than the short story, I should say, because while he's still kind of stock like the short story counterpart, we do see like this unassuming kid that's not necessarily evil, because as we learn, he has some sympathy behind him. He's been bullied in the past. He does have a very annoying sister that he has to deal with as an older brother, so he has some like sympathy there going for him, which is a bit refreshing compared to his other counterpart in the short story, like I mentioned. But we get to see him kind of fall from grace and entertain this idea of you know, misusing power that he's granted. And I should say the episode does a fantastic job of highlighting this point that was completely absent in the short story version, and that is this corruption of power message that is trying to convey. And what it's getting at is that the remote that's given to Seth from this company that he, you know, I guess ordered the remote from, as we learn in the episode, it was from like a newspaper ad. It was given to him, and people who receive the remote are given this gift, but they're told not to misuse it so it doesn't void the warranty and doesn't backfire on them and whatnot. We see that Seth ignores multiple chances that he's given in light of pursuing selfish reasons, and that kind of serves a morality lesson in it all for kids watching out there. And I do think that because of its messages, it stands out as a more thematic story that you'll see in Goosebumps, even though that this idea was clearly ripped from an episode of Twilight Zone. And even, as I mentioned, as a, you know, we can mention this as a joke, Adam Sandler's Click would do a similar idea later on with the same idea. But like I said, I think Seth is a serviceable character, and the acting from him is pretty good. One thing I think this episode does really well is it keeps building tension with the dun 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 warnings as they keep coming through to Seth. And there's something about it how every time Seth is like sleeping or whatever, you know, just taken out of, you know, thinking on things mentally, these messages will come out of nowhere, or when he's about to do something really bad that he shouldn't be doing, these messages come out of nowhere to kind of freak him out. And that does get unsettling over time, because we don't know why these people who make the remotes are doing what they're doing. And I don't think we ever get an explanation on that, which is going to be a negative, but we'll get into that shortly. But there is some solid tension here as well. I think there is some pretty decent atmosphere, which you wouldn't think. There's a decent scope in terms of the setting here. It goes from Seth's house to his school, then they go to like a city to try to track down this building. So that was kind of neat and refreshing for a story that you would think is mostly set in either a house or a school. So that was cool. And yeah, I just think in terms of the story, he gets worse and worse and worse. At first, he's using it against his bully, and then he starts to use it more on his family, and then he uses it against his best friend, who he wanted to include with this ability all along. And you kind of show that how this remote has corrupted him within. And like I said, that ties back to the themes. I just think it fires on all cylinders when it comes to thematic storytelling with this episode version. I have to tip my hat to Scott Peters for doing that with the materials he was given. So yeah, you know, all across the board, even from the supporting cast, there's some decent acting here. Some wonky effects for the 90s show, but nothing too egregious to be mad at here. It's pretty well made for the most part. Now, getting into the negatives, I do have a few here. So let's get into it. There is that 2-minute stretch in the early portions of the episode where I'm just flat out annoyed with all the noise going on from the sisters tap dancing and the dog barking. That 2-minute scene can screw itself. It can just go away. It's annoying. Not the biggest negative, but I just have to bring it up. I don't like that little stretch of minutes in the episode. The second negative I have with this wholesale is, like the short story counterpart, this story is kind of going through events and forcing events in from the book that I don't really think need to be there necessarily. Like in the short story version, you see these scenes of him like trying to eat his favorite dessert at dinner over and over again, and then of course he cheats on a test and stuff. But when we have Kevin into the equation, which is like an episode exclusive character, I feel like there could have been different directions in there to kind of showcase, I guess, through Kevin's perspective as well, on how much Seth is being corrupted here. And I guess the cheating, like the test cheating scene, is fine and all, but in the grand scheme of it all it does is kind of show Kevin early on that Seth is, you know, kind of abusing this. And you don't really need that scene, because if there's any sign that that Seth is abusing this, it would be pausing his own parents. You don't need to have this scene in there. It just kind of comes across like filler. And when we get into the back portion of the episode, it just kind of lacks a climax compared to the short story, which I think the story by far has the better one, where it's more frantic and actually scary with like the accidents that are happening with this remote here. This doesn't have necessarily accidents happening, but there is, in replace, just some meandering. And you'll notice it when, you know, Seth drops the remote fighting with his sister and his family is paused. There's just a lot of just remedial scenes to kind of pad out. Oh, we're going to go to the armchair electronics place, but nobody's there. It's a vacated building. Why are we spending time on this stuff, right? If you're not going to actually expand on it. Now, that brings me to my third negative. The armchair electronics thing is hardly explained in the episode. It's just the company that ships out the remote that Seth so happens to receive. But we don't really get a sense of who's behind it all and why any of this is actually like a thing. Like, it's just one of those things, like, I guess if you prod into it, you can risk over-explaining things, but we have this character, Tony, who is like the spokesperson on these commercials, or I guess the face of the company, and they barely use the guy in the episode, and you're just like, okay, then why is this person here? Which leads me to the ending, right? We spend the whole episode getting told and told and told from, you know, the calls from the armchair electronics place that you need to stop misusing the remote. You need to use it sparingly. You need to use it for only good things. You can't, if you keep doing bad things, you're going to void the warranty. And we keep getting told this void the warranty thing. But when you get to the ending, and now I have to get into some mild spoilers to kind of say why I'm upset with it. It keeps an element from the short story that was pretty evident throughout the short story, which is that the remote drains batteries fast, right? And the battery draining aspect is fine and all, but when we get the twist ending, That's actually the twist of why he's where he is, okay? It's not because he misused a remote or whatever. That's a mild spoiler. It's actually for, like I just said, it may or may not have to do with battery drainage. And when you look at the back of the remote, it's this humongous screen with a battery monitor. And Seth carries around this remote the entire episode. You mean to tell me that Seth didn't notice the battery level getting extremely low? If that's the reason why he ends up where he is, then what's the point with... what's really the point with the whole calling him and harassing him about misusing it and avoiding the warranty? It just makes no coherent sense. Like, it just comes off lackadaisical and just lazy, and you can tell that they're trying to, like, keep elements from the short story in the episode without tying it together. Maybe there was some tie-ins, but maybe they had to cut out some context for runtime. I'm assuming that probably was the case, but still, y'all, come on, man. But with that out of the way, what's my thoughts on Click overall? You know, with those negatives, they are annoying. And it, you know, I guess I'll bring this up as another annoyance. Seth is purposefully not progressing in the story. And I can see why Seth's character would upset a few of you out there if you care about, like, logical character progression. Seth, he's given multiple chances, multiple warnings, and he just keeps going back on what he's learned. It's like almost like he learns nothing, and every scene is all for nothing constantly in the episode. I get that. But for the idea that it's going for, and for the themes it's going for, I'm not going to be a stickler on it, because it's like a good going bad kind of story, misusing power and stuff. So it makes sense thematically. Where I would usually be harsh on it, I'm not going to be harsh on it here. So with that out of the way, those negatives do kind of add up, sadly, for me. I no longer think it's like an A-tier episode. But like I said, I have nostalgia with it. I think the themes really do work. There's a lot of potential here that you can see was added into this that easily could make a full Goosebumps book. And it's still memorable to me. It feels different even for the 90s show standards. It feels more Twilight Zone in nature. So take that for what you will, because they are borrowing it, the concept itself, from Twilight Zone, nonetheless. But I do think it's a B-tier episode, and a pretty solid one at that. So from a 0 to 5-star basis, I decided to deduct 0.8 off for all those issues, and I gave this episode a 4.2 out of 5 stars, which is just a flat B. It could be a whole lot better. You know, maybe try to explain Tony's character a bit better. Maybe be less annoying in some scenes here and there. You know, maybe try to make more coherent sense with the twist. But yeah, if you fix those things, this still could have been an iconic classic episode. And it still is iconic and classic, but not to the same extent as the A-tier episodes are for me. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Click, the episode. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.